Oh, mi amor. Yeah, everybody's got little babies like you, papas. Let's see. All right, so I guess I'll have to give my lecture with Senor here on my lap. It's going to be another kind of history lecture about nationalist movements in the 20th century, particularly during the civil rights movement, but we're going to talk about kind of the predecessor to the nationalist movement and the civil rights movement. The primary excuse me, topic of our lecture today is going to be, we've talked about last time, we've gone through the whole history of capitalism and the race concept and all that. And we've talked about last time about state nationalism, right? About the emergence of nationalism and what nationalist identity is, nationalist ideology. But we talked about nationalism in relation to the modern nation states. So today we're going to talk about the nationalism of stateless populations, the nationalism of oppressed people. And the primary topic of our conversation today is going to be Black nationalism, particularly in the United States. I choose that both because it has a more robust history, but also because it's really the example that's set for other nationalist movements in the U.S., like the Chicano movement, the American Indian movement, the Puerto Rican nationalist movement, in many ways are modeled after the Black nationalist movement, both conceptually and also in their praxis. So I've changed the readings a little bit for next week, or actually next week, sorry, you don't have class for the following week. Next week is Veterans Day, so we won't be meeting. But the following week, I took the Bakunin reading out and added in a reading from Ian Haney Lopez, who's a professor at Berkeley Law School. And he wrote this book about the El Movimiento, the Chicano movement. Senor, this is my lecture, not your lecture. So we'll be talking a little bit about Chicano nationalism next time, but today we're really going to focus on the history of Black nationalism, or the Pan-African movement, as it's often called. So first, I'm going to give you a little bit of background from the 19th century, and then we'll move into the early 20th century, and then talk about the civil rights movement era. So, we talked a lot about the history of the race concept and the emergence of scientific racism, these pseudoscience justifications for racial oppression that were conceived, for the most part somewhat in the 18th, but really in the 19th century is when this stuff took off. And so we went through all of the different, not all of them, but, significant theorists in the history of racial pseudoscience. So that's really kind of the context to think of when we're starting our discussion here of the pre-Civil War period, right? Before the Civil War, the US was one of the last Western countries to abolish slavery. Most other Creole states like us in Latin America and the Caribbean abolished slavery decades before we did, as did the European superpowers. So we were really about the last one. And of course, it took a civil war for us to finally abolish slavery, right? That's the primary issue that the American Civil War was fought over. But before the Civil War, there was an abolitionist movement in this country, right? Today, we have abolitionists as well, which is usually in reference to the prison system, prison abolitionists who want to close the prisons and find alternative ways to deal with social problems than locking people up forever. But of course, in the pre-Civil War period, abolitionism was to abolish black chattel slavery. And abolitionists were, for the most part, almost entirely in northern states. It was very dangerous to be an abolitionist in the South, and many, many abolitionists who tried to bring their message to the South were murdered. But the strategy of abolitionists, in large part prior to the Civil War, was to try to counter this racial pseudoscience that we learned about, right? And so what was the racial pseudoscience of the 19th century? Telling people that that African Americans are inferior and that they, can't function on their own without masters, and that they're fit for slavery and all the rest of this, racist pseudoscience. So how did abolitionists go about countering that? By giving a platform to educated, articulate African Americans who could both write and speak to public audiences to demonstrate to white Americans that African Americans could be just as educated and intelligent and well-spoken as they were, right? And the person you're probably most familiar with, who made a career out of this, kind of traveling on the lecture circuit, writing articles for newspapers and journals and things like that, is a man named Frederick Douglass. I have a picture of him somewhere. I should hope you've heard his name before and maybe even recognize his picture, right? And so Frederick Douglass was a man who had escaped slavery. He had been born into slavery and escaped, and came to the North and was educated, and was, an excellent writer, and was, very articulate and well-spoken, and could not only speak to the evils of slavery, of what being in slavery really was like, but could also kind of counter this racist pseudoscience, demonstrating with his own person how intelligent and articulate African Americans were, and that all of this, this race science nonsense was really, was nonsense, that it wasn't true, that people from Africa were somehow, less intelligent or inferior to Europeans. And so, this is a classic, since the 18th, 19th century, that this racist pseudoscience was conceived. African Americans and their white allies have really struggled to demonstrate that these racist perceptions of them are in fact nonsense, right? And sadly, still, people, some African Americans feel that they have to demonstrate their worth as human beings, which, hundreds of years later, there's still a lot of people who believe this garbage. So Frederick Douglass was really probably the most prominent person. Another person you might be familiar with, because his book was made into a movie, maybe you've seen it, was Solomon Northup, whose book 12 Years a Slave was made into a movie about, I don't know, 10 or 20 years ago. Has anybody seen that or read the book? Really disturbing. I mean, it's powerful, but it's really gives you a sense of what it must have been like to be a slave in the black chattel slavery system. It's just heartbreaking. Solomon Northup had actually been born a free man in the North and was educated and had a family, and and he had been tricked into going down to Washington, D.C. He played music. He was a musician, ostensibly under the belief that he would be hired to play some music for a job. And the people who lured him down there kidnapped him and took him into the South and sold him into slavery, which was kind of a hustle for especially unscrupulous white people in the 19th century, was to kidnap free African Americans and send them sell them off into slavery in the South. And so, he certainly knew that he was a free man, but once he was sucked into this system in the South, he had no way of, demonstrating who he was. And so he basically had to hide who he was for many years, and eventually managed to get word to his friends in the North that he was actually alive and was being held somewhere as a slave. And they, some of his white friends in the North, basically did the legal work and came down there and got him and brought him back. So after that experience, he wrote this book, 12 Years a Slave, to, kind of bring awareness to how horrible slavery was. But also, he traveled and gave speeches to public audiences, and he, continued to write and things like that, essentially for the same purpose, to bring awareness to how horrible slavery was and to demonstrate to white Americans that all of this racist pseudoscience was actually garbage, and African Americans were just as capable and intelligent and competent and, well-spoken as white Americans were. Actually, Frederick Douglass and Solomon Northup were probably a hell of a lot more educated and well-spoken than most white Americans were at the time. Perhaps even today, I don't know. So this is kind of like, the model that many African Americans have pursued since that period. And in the early 20th century, there were also kind of racial spokespersons in the Black community who kind of the same thing, were demonstrating to white America how competent and intelligent and so forth that African Americans were, but who had very different perspectives. So I'm gonna mention two in passing, and then we're gonna focus on the third. The first that I'll mention is a man named Booker T. Washington. I got a picture of him here too. Here's Booker T. Washington. He was kind of maybe the first real racial spokesperson on behalf of African Americans, though his perspectives, many African Americans and their allies have critiqued. His perspective, which was really ensconced in the speech that made him famous called the Atlanta Compromise. And in it, he suggested that African Americans shouldn't resist their subordination in American society and shouldn't, try and make an issue out of their, legal subordination and Jim Crow and all of these types of things. That instead they should educate themselves and start businesses and kind of, try to live try to assimilate into American society without challenging the status quo. So needless to say, he was very popular among white Americans who thought that African Americans should accept their place in life and should not challenge the status quo. He was even invited to the White House. He was a personal acquaintance of Teddy Roosevelt when Teddy Roosevelt was president. Certainly people in the white business community were very fond of him and sponsored him and so forth, because they liked his kind of his encouraging African Americans to acquiesce to the system of racial subordination that they experienced at that time and in many ways do today. So let's stop him. And next up is W.E.B. Du Bois, or Dubois, as he pronounced his name. Du Bois was the first African-American to earn a PhD from Harvard. And his work is really considered foundational in our field in sociology. He wrote, and in racial and ethnic studies more generally. He wrote a lot about race in America, and his magnum opus, Black Reconstruction in America, is really kind of foundational for the study of race and ethnicity in this country. He was also the president of the NAACP for a long time. And while he, in one sense, he's kind of assimilationist in the sense that he's, trying to demonstrate to white America how intelligent and educated African Americans can be. He was also very critical of white supremacy and the status quo, certainly among his peers, but his ideas still, carry weight today. So I'll mention him again as we talk about the next kind of the main topic of our conversation for the first half of class, which is a man named Marcus Garvey. But you know what? Before I talk about Garvey, let me talk about the first Pan-African Conference. So the Pan-Africanism, the idea of Pan-Africanism, the idea of Black nationalism really started around the turn of the 20th century. And it's, everybody, like I say, scholars have different ideas and so forth, but people generally agree that kind of the first coalescing of this idea was what's called the first Pan-African Conference. Later, they changed the name to the Pan-African Congress. And it was not an annual, but every so many years, there would be this event. And the first one was organized in 1909 in London by an attorney named Henry Sylvester Williams, who was of Trinidadian origin. Do you guys know where the islands of Trinidad and Tobago are? They're kind of in the Caribbean, like northeast of South America. And so he was living in London, and he organized this conference for people who were interested in a Pan-African, creating kind of a Pan-African identity and community to attend. Now, the idea of Pan-Africanism is an idea that was really conceived among the African diaspora population, right? And what do we mean by that? Diaspora are people who have been, removed from their homeland one way or another. So another example is the Jewish diaspora of Jews who were removed from Judea by the Romans and spread throughout Europe, right? And so people who were kidnapped from Africa and sold into slavery in, either in North or South America or the Caribbean, or in some cases to Europe, right, were people whose, someone asked the Atlanta Compromise. Yeah, that's what I had meant. In the process of the slave trade, people who had been kidnapped, they knew where they had come from, right? And they knew what cultural, linguistic, tribal, what community they had come from. But over the generations of chattel slavery, people have lost the memories of their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents' descent. So very few African Americans today can trace their family history to some specific region within Africa, right? They can't, most people cannot tell you that, I'm descended from the Yoruba or the Igbo or the, whatever, from Angola or from wherever in Africa. And so people who are part of the African diaspora have this kind of, they've lost the memory of their descent, of who exactly their ancestors are. Now, today they have these DNA tests, which are really junk science, but they do identify markers that are more likely to be carried by people in certain regions. So you can get one of these tests. And it'll show, maybe you have a marker that's very common among the Yoruba in modern day Nigeria. And so probably some ancestor of yours that was kidnapped from Africa was part of the Yoruba, and that's why they were sold into slavery. So now people can, these things aren't, exact, but you can kind of at least have some idea of where your ancestors came from. But of course, 100 years ago, this genetic stuff didn't exist. So people really didn't know where in Africa they came from. So they didn't have an identity that was connected to any particular community within Africa. People who are from Africa, right, they know where their, what their community is. They're part of a linguistic community or a spiritual community or, cultural community, or whatever their identities are based on their local, where they live. But for people who are members of the African diaspora who are living in the Americas or in Europe, they don't have that. And so they imagine that there's this identity that links all people of African descent, right? And so it's clear that this is an idea that came from a diaspora perspective. People in Africa aren't thinking this way because they're already part of a community and they know who they are and what they're, where they're from. So the first Pan-African Congress, fittingly was attended almost entirely by members of the African diaspora population, people from North America, primarily people from North America and the Caribbean, a few from Europe, and only a handful of people who actually were from Africa. Now today, 100 years later, Pan-African ideology has spread in different parts of Africa. So there are people in Africa who believe in Pan-Africanism, but it's, by no means universal. It's much more popular in the Americas, particularly here in the US, than it is necessarily in Africa. So Marcus Garvey is the person we're going to kind of focus on for this first half of the lecture. So he didn't invent Pan-Africanism, he didn't invent Black nationalism, but he's probably the most important person in the early 20th century to popularize these ideas and to kind of add elements, institutions to a Pan-Africanist Black nationalist identity that are part of these inherent institutions that nationalist identities have that we talked about last time, right? So let's talk a little about Marcus Garvey and who he was. Let me show you his picture, first of all. He was known for wearing these pompous outfits. You can see here, like he was an admiral or general or dictator of some country, which was essentially his aspiration. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but just so you have an idea of what I'm talking about here. This is the famous picture here. Why don't I share my notes so you can follow as I talk? So Garvey was born in the late 19th century, 1887, I guess. And he was from Kingston, Jamaica, which is the capital of Jamaica and the largest city in Jamaica. And as a young man, he started this organization called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, in 1914. And the purpose of the organization was to encourage Black nationalist identity and to kind of encourage unity and among the African diaspora population, starting in Kingston, but also, he had ambitions for other places. In Kingston, in the early years of the organization, there were accusations from within the organization of impropriety, that he had embezzled money from the organization, and essentially that he was using the organization as a hustle to get donations from people, and then he was using the money for his own purposes instead of to promote the interests of Africans. So in 1917, he fled Jamaica under this kind of haze of accusations of embezzlement and impropriety, and restarted the UNIA in New York. And it became very popular in the US. at its height, it had, thousands, if not tens of thousands of members all across the U.S. About half of United States within the U.S. had a chapter, had a UNIA chapter. And so this was really a mass organization, a nationwide organization. That doesn't mean that a large proportion of African Americans were members, but that this wasn't just a few dozen or a couple of hundred people, in a single, in a church in New York, so in Harlem somewhere, right? This is an organization that really became very popular and took off. And his rhetoric was much more combative and rejected assimilation into white society. And so it was really kind of a counterposition to the likes of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. And we can understand why this type of rhetoric would be appealing to African Americans, where they've got Booker T. Washington telling them that they should just turn the other cheek and accept the status quo, and Marcus Garvey is over here telling them, fuck white people. We don't need white people. We're just as capable of them. We can create our own society separate from them, right? This kind of similar thing happened in New York as had happened in Kingston before. We're going to talk a little bit more about his ideas in a second, but let me just kind of give the history of his career. He was challenged from within the organization. People, again, were concerned about financial improprieties and that he was embezzling money and so forth. And so he was actually voted out of the organization by the membership of the organization at one point. But he sued in U.S. Court, in the federal court system, and the courts reinstated him as the leader of the organization, based on the ruling that he had started the organization, and so he owned the copyright to it. And so he kind of regained control through the court by suing and winning in the courts. Probably the peak of the organization was in 1920. They had a rally, kind of like a Trump rally, but of African Americans instead of angry white Americans, in Madison Square Garden. And Madison Square Garden is the premier venue in New York City. It holds, I don't know what the capacity is, tens and tens of thousands of people. It's where all the sports teams play, the political debates, the big boxing fights, and so they had a big rally there, and just kind of as a demonstration of his popularity at the time, they filled the place up. They sold out Madison Square Garden, which is a big accomplishment. It really demonstrates how popular his movement was at the time. And at this rally, he was declared the president of Africa. And you can tell by his little outfits, his dictator outfits, like he was, that was kind of how he saw himself. He never actually stepped foot in Africa over the course of his life, and never spoke any of the thousands of languages, that are in Africa, or really didn't have much knowledge of cultures or peoples or communities within Africa. But this, diaspora perspective that all people from Africa should be in one identity, and that all of Africa should be one giant country with him as president. Ultimately, he was expelled from the United States as a result of basically wire fraud. The UNIA had all of these different businesses running. A big part of their platform was to encourage African Americans to start their own businesses and have their own separate, everything. So they had, magazines and newspapers and, all range of different businesses to serve the Black community. And part of his ambition was to essentially to colonize Africa, to create colonies of African Americans within Africa that would presumably lead the native Africans and provide them with the civilization that they lack. Actually, the official statement of purpose of the UNIA was to establish a brotherhood among the Black race, to promote a spirit of race pride, to reclaim the fallen, and to assist in civilizing the backward tribes of Africa. So, you know, if you think people in Africa are backwards, like clearly you're working from a Eurocentric colonial perspective, right? And so this was kind of his perspective that members of the African diaspora population who had been educated according to European standards and had been civilized according to European standards, and who, you know, basically live similar lives as European colonial superpowers and their colonies, right? That this was kind of these were the people who would provide the leadership for the rest of Africa, which he presumed were, you know, I don't know, running savage in the jungle or something. And so they started this shipping line. The biggest shipping line in that day was called the White Star Line. Probably its most famous ship you're familiar with is the Titanic that sunk, right? And the White Star Line, you know, back then did not allow African Americans to travel with white passengers, right? Everything in America was segregated back then. And so Garvey decided to start the Black Star Line, which would be like a black counterpart to the White Star Line. So it would be a ship line for African Americans. And his idea was that these ships would travel between the east coast of the US, the Caribbean, and West Africa, ferrying African Americans to Africa to resettle in Western Africa. But the business, you know, the finances of the business were not in order. And some of the ships they bought were, you know, not seaworthy, and basically ended up needed to be junked. And so they lost a lot of money. They raised a lot of money, but they lost a lot of money. And in trying to raise money, one of the things he did was he sold stock in a ship he was planning to buy. So he didn't actually own the ship, but he was selling ownership in this ship. And in America, that's wire fraud. And so because he'd never actually owned the ship, but he had sold shares of the ship to people ostensibly as an investment, he was prosecuted for fraud and convicted and given a 5-year sentence. After only 2 years, however, he was released. You can imagine, you know, the thousands of his supporters sent letters to the president, you know, pleading for him to be released from prison. And so the president commuted his sentence after only 2 years, under the condition that he be deported back to his native Jamaica, which he was. So in 1925, he was released from prison and boarded a ship back to Kingston. In Kingston, he again tried to start the UNIA up again, but again, between financial mismanagement and scandal and so forth, it basically the same thing happened, it collapsed. And eventually in 1935, he immigrated to London, basically in disrepute and in poor financial circumstances, and basically died poor and alone, obscure in London in 1940. So even though he kind of died in obscurity and his career during his life kind of collapsed, after his death, particularly in the civil rights movement, he was kind of plucked out of obscurity, and people started reconsidering his ideas, and you know, people started reading his speeches and things he had written and things like that. And it kind of formed a foundation for the Black nationalist movement in the civil rights era. Now, between the civil rights era and Garvey, there were Black nationalist movements in this country, so I'm kind of skipping over a bit of history here. Probably the two most notable are the Moorish Science Temple and the Nation of Islam, both of which are still active and have chapters in cities around the country. And of course, the most well-known person from the Nation of Islam was Malcolm X, who was assassinated. And so let's kind of fast forward to the post Malcolm X assassination period. Sorry, give me 1 sec. Let me do something with the baby real quick here. Okay. Yeah, so someone said, yeah, actually Evelyn's comment, it basically sums it up, right? Actually, there's a few, I think I actually glazed over a few things. Let me share that again to kind of make Evelyn's point a little better. So even though Garvey, Garvey was basically a racial separatist. His ideology was that African Americans and white Americans should be segregated and should live completely separate lives, that there should be black banks and white banks, and black shipping line and white shipping line, and black newspapers and white newspapers, and so on and so forth. And so internally within the US, there should be kind of two Americas, a black America and a white America. And that ultimately African Americans and people of African origin the world over should all return to Africa and establish a Pan-African state that encompasses the whole continent with him as dictator for life. Now he added a pretty significant institution to the Black nationalist, the Pan-Africanist movement that we talked about last time, which is the flag. The Pan-Africanist flag is here. You guys probably recognize it, red, black, and green. And so it should be obvious that this flag is essentially modeled on the flags of European colonial powers, right? This is the same pattern as, the flag of France, for example, has the same pattern. The only difference is that he's changed the colors, right? So it's really a fitting symbolic representation of Black nationalism, which conceptually is kind of like a mirror image of white nationalism. So it has all of the facets of white nationalism, except that it turns white nationalism on its head, right? Instead of, remember, the race concept is that there's a hierarchy with white people at the top and black people at the bottom. And so Black nationalists kind of accept all of the other facets of the race concept and nationalist ideology, except for that one. Their hierarchy is flipped. Black people are at the top and white people are at the bottom, right? So it's kind of like a mirror image of white nationalism. And that's why the Pan-Africanist flag is really a good representation of that ideology, because it's kind of like it's a copy of European colonial flags. He was very critical of people that he felt were that were collaborating with white people. People like Booker T. Washington and W.E. Du Bois, and particularly of the NAACP, which he felt was funded by white people and was controlled by white people, and was just kind of like a front that people like Du Bois were kind of that they basically were sellouts, that they had sold out to white America. And so he was very critical of the NAACP and of Du Bois. For his credit, Du Bois for most of his career, tried his best to ignore Garvey. And when on the rare occasions that he did comment on Garvey, he basically thought that Garvey was a populist thug, a demagogue, kind of like he thought of Garvey as being like the Black Trump kind of, and didn't take him seriously. And to my knowledge, I don't think they ever engaged. I'm not sure. I don't think they ever met, or, they didn't ever had like a debate or anything like that. Um, I may be mistaken about that, but I'm probably not. I'm pretty sure that they never met or really engaged in any substantive kind of way. But even though Garvey, made a career out of denouncing African Americans who had anything to do with white America, he himself, ironically, had met with the leaders of the KKK on numerous occasions and had dialogue with them. And they basically came to the conclusion that they all had the same a goal, which was essentially a racially divided and segregated America, right? And ultimately for people of African descent to go back to Africa and leave America to the white Americans. So they actually got along quite well, ironic. So while he's criticizing the NAACP for collaborating with white people, many people have accused him of collaborating with the KKK, or at least finding common ground. But like I said, it really shouldn't be that surprising, because this nationalist ideology is really a mirror image of the white nationalism, the European colonial nationalism that we talked about last time. He was also a great admirer of the Italian fascist dictator Mussolini, who was also the leader of an ethno-nationalist movement, right? Trying to establish and promote Italian nationalism. He even would joke that Mussolini was copying him, that he did it first, and that Mussolini was his admirer instead of the other way around. During World War I, he had attempted to join the U.S. Army. He was a lifelong Roman Catholic. So there's kind of like a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? Contradictions within Garvey, between his rhetoric and his beliefs and what he actually did during his life. So we're going to see a lot of those same contradictions with the next topic of our lecture here, who is, in my opinion, one of the leading figures in the Black nationalist movement of the civil rights era. Let me show you his picture before we Ron Karenga, born Ron Everett and changed his name to Maulana Karenga. You can see in his classic boo-boo attire. We'll talk about that in a minute. Share the notes again. So many people just call him Ron Karenga, combining his two names. Ron Karenga was a native of Maryland who moved to Southern California in the early 60s and was a student at LA City College and at UCLA. He was actually elected the president of the student body at LA City College in 1961. This is kind of a period where, for the first time, Westerners were trying to learn about Africa and were teaching about Africa in American universities. So there were classes at LACC being taught by a professor who was at that time they called it an Africanist, who had learned an African language and was teaching material about Africa. And Ron Karenga took all of these courses and basically became obsessed with learning everything he could about Africa. So the language, of course, that he learned there at LACC was Swahili, which today is kind of a lingua franca for African Americans, right? Many African Americans learn Swahili, or have their children learn Swahili, particularly within prison, carceral environments in the U.S. Swahili is used as kind of a lingua secretum, a secret language among African American inmates. And Karenga, just like Garvey made the Pan-African flag popular, he added that kind of institution to Black nationalist identity. Karenga, I think more than anybody, can really be credited with the popularity of Swahili among African Americans. We've talked about this before. It makes a lot of sense, as a language to, if you're going to learn a language in Africa, Swahili is a good choice. It's easier to learn because it's a rather new Bantu language. There's no tone, there's no tonal grammar or any of that more complicated stuff you get from some of the older Niger Congo languages. And it's also kind of it was dumbed down a bit about 1,000 years ago because of the pidgin between Arabic and Swahili, what we call Kiswahili. However, I think we mentioned this before, it's from East Africa. So the chances are that, of all the people who were kidnapped from Africa and brought to the New World, probably not a single one of them was a native Swahili speaker, right? It only became popular in Africa because of the spread of Arab traders. I'm sorry, guys, I got something in my eye. I need to take a break. Why don't we take a 10-minute break real quick? We'll come back at 7:02. All right, guys, let's start bringing it back. I want to watch puppets. All right, I'm going to share my screen again with the notes. Here we go. So Karenga. So basically everything Karenga learned about Africa, he was learning from American universities, right? And much of the material was being taught to him by Americans and people of European origin, white people. And most of the major work at the time on Africa was coming out of American and European universities. Probably the best example, one of the most influential books on Africa from the mid 20th century was the work of anthropologists, and probably the best example, it's Eileen Krieg's Social System of the Zulus. And I remember we talked about what anthropology is and where it came from, and what it does is essentially, it was started as a colonial discipline, essentially to prove that non-European people are inferior to people of European descent. And so European and American anthropologists would go to other parts of the world and do their research for field work for a couple of years and then come back and write a book about it. So this book that Eileen Krieg wrote about the Zulus in Southeast Africa became very popular in the US, and it had a lot of influence on Karenga, as did the work of Native Africans, leaders of nationalist liberation movements in Africa who were trying to kick out colonial powers and take control of the country. Africans basically take control of their own countries, right? So probably the most influential for Karenga among those, and one of the most significant ones was the Kenyan independence movement, which was led by Jomo Kenyatta, which when it succeeded in expelling the British from Kenya, Kenyatta became the first president of Kenya, kind of living up to what Garvey wanted to do. Kenyatta became president for life. And actually, he was in power for over 20 years until he died. And actually, his son today is the president of Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta. So, we left monarchical, we left monarchy back in the 17th century, but still today, people shit in this country, probably one of Trump's sons is going to end up being president someday. This kind of nepotism of oligarchy is, pervasive in modern nation states, right? Actually, Uhuru Kenyatta is one of the world leaders who's named in the Panama Papers. Have you guys heard of that? The Panama Papers is these documents that were released by whistleblower that show the vast wealth that world leaders have hidden away in Caribbean island banks and stuff like that. And Kenyatta has something like $500 million squirreled away in, off the books bank accounts in mostly in the Caribbean. So liberation for the Kenyatas, but maybe not for the Kenyans. And so this is kind of what Karenga aspired to, right? Is he also wanted to create, like Garvey, like Kenyatta did in Kenya, a Black nation, a Pan-Africanist nation with himself as the leader. Now, the name that he chose for himself, Maulana, is also symbolic of his ambitions. The meaning of Maulana is master teacher. So, and we'll also see this within the organization he founded, had a very hierarchical, it was hierarchically structured with him at the top of the pyramid. And so that his name reflects that. So like I said, he was very influential. He was one of the primary purveyors of Swahili language learning among African Americans. He also was one of the purveyors of this practice of assuming Africanized names, of taking names from different parts of Africa and renouncing one's slave name, one's anglicized European American name, and replacing it with an African name of their own choosing. Or, of course, now many Pan-Africanists have children and grandchildren, and so people give their children African names. But of course, very few people really know where in Africa their ancestors come from. So people pick names and kind of appropriate different cultural praxis from different parts of Africa because they don't really know what part of Africa they're from. And Karenga is very representative of this. He chooses names from different parts of West Africa. The language that he chose is from East Africa. He's probably the primary person that made African clothing styles popular in the US. The dashikis, the colorful shirts that Pan-Africanists wear, were appropriated from the Yoruba people who are in the southwest of modern-day Nigeria. And also the bubus, which is the outfit that Karenga was wearing in those pictures, which is appropriated from the Hausa people, who are the dominant population in Nigeria. They're the Muslim population in Nigeria from the north. What's the north of current Nigeria? So they kind of take different facets from different parts of Africa and kind of weave it together into a Pan-African identity, which is different from people who actually are Yoruba or Hausa or or Bantu or whatever, who have their own kind of cultural package of beliefs and identities and foods and clothing and language and so forth. The Hausa speak Hausa Fulani. The Yoruba speak Yoruba. They don't, nobody in West Africa speaks Swahili. It's mostly countries on the east part of Africa who have even chosen Swahili as a lingua franca. But actually, Kenya is a good example of that. Swahili is the state language in Kenya, but it was chosen not because it was the most common language in the country. Actually, it was very obscure. It was chosen because they didn't want to choose the language of one of the major ethnic groups, because it would have kind of been favoritism and the other ethnic groups would have opposed that. So Swahili was kind of chosen as like a neutral language. So now, Karenga was far from the only African-American who took on an Africanized name. There's many, Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, Leroy Jones, Amiri Baraka. Karenga was far from the only Black nationalist and Pan-Africanist during the Civil Rights era, but I kind of focus on him for this lecture because he's, in my opinion, a really good example of the different facets of Pan-Africanist identity. And also he was very influential, as I'm mentioning. He kind of created a lot of institutions that make up the modern Pan-Africanist identity, and particularly here in Los Angeles, where basically his whole career was. So let's talk a little bit about the organization that he founded in 1965, called the US organization, as in us versus them, us being African Americans and them being white Americans. He founded the organization with a man named Hakeem Jamal in the wake of the Malcolm X assassination. Jamal was actually a personal acquaintance, a close friend of Malcolm X, knew Malcolm X personally quite well. Karenga had never met Malcolm X, but they wanted to use Malcolm X's popularity to attract people to join their new organization. And so they printed up T-shirts with a picture of Malcolm X on it. So in the first year of the organization, the members would wear these Malcolm X shirts to kind of identify the group with Malcolm X and draw people to the organization. After about a year, Hakeem Jamal and Karenga had a falling out, presumably because Karenga wanted to take over control of the organization, and Jamal just basically, left the organization and went about his life. And so after Karenga, took over the organization, it kind of turned into a cult of personality centered around him. A good indication of that is the T-shirts. And they went from, originally they had pictures of Malcolm X on them. After the break with Jamal, he changed the T-shirts so that they would have his picture on them. So members of the US organization would wear these shirts with a picture of Ron Karenga on them. Membership in the organization was for life, and there was a strict hierarchy with him at the top and different levels, kind of ranks among the members based on their knowledge of things that he had taught them. The kind of the theoretical framework that Karenga identified with, which he wasn't, he had no compunctions about, it, and which he called cultural nationalism. So he wasn't, some nationalists kind of deny being nationalists because it has a negative connotation to it, but Karenga didn't, like Trump is another example of that. Remember when Trump gave this speech and he said, "I'm a nationalist," some people just don't give a fuck, but some people try to hide it. So Karenga was not trying to hide his nationalism. In fact, he was a strong believer in nationalism. And so he felt that this was what African Americans should pursue. And cultural nationalism is the idea that by appropriating aspects of African cultures and by creating a Pan-African cultural identity, that would be a way of achieving liberation from white supremacy. Now, this focus on culture is, if you think about it, is really in large part a result of his education, which was in large part from anthropological sources like Eileen Krieg. And of course, anthropology is focused, primarily with culture. So this idea that liberation can be achieved through cultural praxis is probably something that came, whether consciously or subconsciously, came out of his familiarity with anthropological literature. His perspectives were very similar to Garvey, right? He basically denounced white people, and thought that African Americans and Africans and so forth should live separate lives and have separate businesses and communities and culture and cultural practices, and they should dress differently, and they should speak their own languages and have different names, and so on and so forth. And basically rejected anything that was associated with European or American identity. He was opposed to Marxism and other revolutionary theoretical frameworks on the grounds that they were conceived by Europeans and therefore not appropriate for Africans. He denounced anyone who he felt was working with white people, particularly here in Los Angeles and also in San Diego. The US organization was an opponent of the Black Panther Party, and Karenga was very critical of the Black Panther Party, and he basically accused them of being sellouts to white America because the Black Panther Party organized with white groups and with Puerto Ricans and with Chicanos and with the American Indian movement and so forth. He felt that African Americans should only be worrying about themselves and shouldn't be involved with these other groups, right? And that's a very nationalist perspective, right? That solidarity should be within the race, not between different races. Whereas the Black Panther Party had the opposite perspective, which they called internationalism. They believed that all of the different oppressed peoples of the world need to have solidarity with one another in order to oppose capitalism, which is the root of the oppression. So you can see these are theoretically, these are very different perspectives, right? And they're in conflict, they clash. And the clashes between the Panthers and the US organization became violent, and actually the 4 Black Panthers were murdered by members of the US organization, including the president and vice president of the Los Angeles chapter of the Black Panther Party, Alprentice Bunchy Carter and John Huggins, who were assassinated on the ground in Campbell Hall at UCLA at 3:00 in the afternoon, in the middle of a Black student union meeting. There was a verbal and physical confrontation between us and BPP members at the meeting, and at least one of the US organization members pulled out a gun and shot Bunchy Carter and John Huggins dead right there in front of dozens of witnesses. Now, since the assassinations, we found out that these assassinations were actually orchestrated by the FBI, just like the assassination of Fred Hampton. Now, the Fred Hampton assassination, we have really good documentation because some activists broke into the FBI field office and stole the files, stole the COINTELPRO file on Fred Hampton, where it showed that the FBI had masterminded the whole assassination. And they even had a confidential informant, this man, William O'Neill, who was part of Fred Hampton's inner circle. And he had provided them with maps of the apartment where they were staying so that the hit team, the Chicago Police Department, are the ones that pulled the trigger, that they would know exactly where to enter and where Hampton would be so that they could, charge in there and shoot him to death, which is what they did. O'Neill even drugged Hampton and his wife at dinner that night so that he wouldn't be able to resist when the door got kicked down. And that's basically what happened. Chicago police kicked the door down, stormed in, and machine gunned him to death. And so the Hampton assassination, we have really good documentation that the FBI, masterminded the whole thing. But the Bunchy Carter, John Huggins assassination, we don't have that type of evidence because no one stole the file. We don't have the actual paperwork. But we do have a lot of different points of evidence that suggest that members of the US organization were working for the FBI at the time of the assassination, including the shooter and these 2 brothers, the Steiner brothers, who were involved in the assassination. The shooter was a man named Claude Hubert, who escaped the scene. There's one witness that says that they saw Claude Hubert being driven from the scene and the Steiner brothers by an FBI agent. Claude Hubert was never seen again, by all accounts, except for one of the Steiner brothers, Larry Steiner. The Steiner brothers were convicted of the murder, and they actually went to prison, the both of them, to San Quentin. And 2 years after George Jackson was assassinated at San Quentin prison, they miraculously escaped and disappeared for 20 years or so. And after about 20 years, Larry Steiner reappeared and said that he had fallen on hard times in Suriname, where he claimed to have been living for many years, and basically asked the US State Department if he could turn himself in, if his wife and children would be given passage into the United States, which eventually happened. His children all live here in Los Angeles. And so he went back to prison after going 20 years on the lam on a double murder case. Somehow he was given no additional time, and he's actually been released from prison a few years ago. So he's a free man now, which is a pretty generous parole decision on the part of state of California. By comparison, Bunchy Carter's only surviving brother, their third brother, was also murdered, assassinated during the Civil Rights Movement era. Bunchy Carter's surviving brother's name is Kenneth Fatty Carter. He's in prison right now in California. He has been in prison in California since 1971 and has not been granted parole. He's been eligible for parole since the 1970s, since the late 70s, and has been denied parole for over 40 years, right? So somehow this guy that was guilty of a double murder and escaped from prison and went on the lam for 20 years, somehow he got released from prison, but Kenneth Carter is still in prison. So I don't know if you need Inspector Clouseau to figure this one out for you, but I don't. So anyways, there's also other evidence. There's a FBI agent who was part of the Los Angeles COINTELPRO team, who basically felt bad about what he had done in his career. And when he retired, he wrote an expose, a book, basically, exposing many aspects of what the COINTELPRO program did. His name is Wesley Swearingen. And in his book, and also in interviews that he's given, he's identified the Steiner brothers as being FBI assets as well. So it seems pretty clear that at least some of the members of the US organization were actually FBI assets who were placed in order to murder and dismantle and oppose the Black Panther Party, particularly here in Los Angeles. They also killed 2 Black Panther members down in San Diego, Sylvester Bell and, why am I forgetting the other guy's name? I should know this. Maybe it'll come to me. As far as Karenga goes, there's no paperwork or anything proving that he was an FBI asset. The only evidence that he was directly involved with the FBI comes from a book that was written by someone who themselves had been an FBI asset, and he flipped and wrote a tell-all book about his, work as a COINTELPRO, provocateur. His name is Louis Tackwood, and his book is called The Glass House, which was published in the 1973 or 4, something like that. Good luck finding a copy of it. And so in the Louis Tackwood book, he says that Karenga was receiving weapons from the FBI. So that's really the only direct evidence that Karenga himself was involved with the FBI. But other than that, there's not really any paperwork or, like we have for the Hampton assassination. So, but many people, particularly people who were active in the Black Panther Party, believe that Karenga was an FBI plant. And so there's been accusations to that effect for many, many years since the 70s. Karenga himself was arrested. Before I mention that, this is kind of similar to Garvey too. Even though Karenga denounced the Black Panther Party for collaborating with white people, he himself met with both the chief of police of Los Angeles Police Department, and then had 2 secret meetings with Ronald Reagan when he was governor of California to advise them on how to quell unrest in the Black community after the Watts riots. So even though he was kind of like Garvey met with the KKK, Karenga met with Reagan, with Governor Reagan, to try and advise him on how to tamp down the riots in Black communities in California. So you kind of see like this history repeating itself, and it's really the same nationalist framework that Karenga and Garvey are both operating from. Karenga was arrested in 1971 and charged for, I forgot what the exact charges were, but something to the effect of kidnapping and torture 2 women who wanted to leave the US organization. And of course, the membership was supposed to be for life, Karenga and some of his Confederates kidnapped them and tortured them to prevent them or to punish them for leaving the organization. And they ended up testifying against him, along with his wife at the time, also testified against him. And he ended up getting convicted of, I don't think he was convicted of kidnapping. I forgot. I think he was convicted of torture. I'm not sure. It wasn't, I don't think he actually was convicted of kidnapping, which would have been a much worse charge. And ostensibly, he did 4 years in prison and was released in 1975. Now, again, there's people in the Black Panther Party who allege that he never went to prison because there's no one that anyone can find that actually was on a prison yard with him. I don't know how true that is, but I do know, that prison is a very small place, and people who are in prison, spend time on yards with different people, and you can pretty much, if you were really on a prison yard, you should be able to. There should be people who were there with you that can say that you were there. So this is a critique that former Black Panther Party members have made, that where are the people who were on the yard with him? They can't be found. So I don't know if he was really in prison or not, but that's just an accusation that's been made. So anyways, after being released in 1975, he earned a PhD the very next year in 1976 from U.S. International University, now called Alliant International University, a university I've never actually heard of outside of Karenga. So I can't tell you much about that. But I can tell you it's pretty impressive, it's very impressive, to have earned a PhD in a single year after being released from prison. It took me 11 years to get my PhD, and I think the average is 6 or 7, and 4 years is considered, really fast. And we have a lot of formerly incarcerated students in school now, and I've never heard of someone coming out of prison and getting a PhD in 1 year. He also got an honorary PhD that was awarded by USC in 1994. And since getting out of prison and becoming an academic, he has really been very influential in the field of Pan-African studies. He's published, I don't know how many articles, multiple books. He wrote the introductory textbook for Pan-African studies. That's the most common, like if you take a intro to Pan-African studies class at any university, the most common textbook that's used for that class, he wrote. And he's still alive today. He's a professor, and last I checked, he's still chair of Africana Studies at Cal State Long Beach. He's been at Cal State Long Beach for decades. So you can actually go and take a class with him. His students have gone on to become faculty in different Pan-African studies, Black studies departments, including on our campus. One of his most prominent mentees is our former chair of Pan-African Studies, Melina Abdullah, who's also the leader of Black Lives Matter Los Angeles. She's said on multiple occasions that Karenga was, one of her primary mentors. So there's a direct line connection between Karenga and Black nationalists of the Civil Rights Movement era and Black nationalist leaders and academics today, even on our own campus. For the 50th anniversary of the Pan-African Studies department on our campus, which was, I think, 2 years ago, they invited Karenga to be the keynote speaker. I was there. I witnessed it. So Karenga hasn't, he's a historical figure, but he's still alive and he's still active and he's still involved in leading, ethnic studies. And also it's worth, noting that, Pan-African Studies, Black Studies was really the first, he formed the first Pan-African, African Studies department, the first real ethnic studies department in the US. And that's really the model for the ethnic studies that we're familiar with today, right? On our campus, we have Pan-African Studies, we have Chicano Latino Studies, and now they've started an ethnic studies college. So now all of those departments, they used to be in natural and social sciences, but now they have their own ethnic studies college. So all of that ethnic studies, stuff on all different sides really in large part traces back to Karenga. So that, he's been really influential in the academy. And, we talked about nationalism, European nationalism, right? And what was kind of the basis for spreading that nationalist ideology was also the university system. Remember how we talked about Benedict Anderson, one of the primary institutions of a nationalist society are the museums and the universities and the intellectuals who propagate this ideology among the population, right? And so that's just as true today with our modern ethnic studies departments as it was in 19th century Europe. And that's really why I choose Karenga to talk to you guys about and to give you a reading about as kind of the model for racial ethnic ethno-nationalism today. The reading that you have for this week is about the US organization. So it talks about the history and the practices of the US organization and Karenga's background. Can't remember what exact sections I assigned to you because I try to limit your reading, but it's a sympathetic account, right? It's a book that was written by someone, he's a professor, Scott Brown, he's a professor at UCLA, in I don't think they call it Pan-African Studies. I forgot what the title of their department is, but in any case, it's a sympathetic account of the US organization and Karenga. So I think it's important, for you guys to read different perspectives, right? So that's your reading. So this is the lecture for today, and that's the reading for this week. Next week, we're going to look at a speech that was given by Fred Hampton, actually his last recorded speech that we know of before Hampton was assassinated, in which he's very critical of Karenga and Stokely Carmichael and Black nationalism more generally. So we're going to look at that, and we're going to look at that Henny Lopez reading. That's a critique of Chicano nationalism. And then we're also going to have a more contemporary critique of identity politics from a professor at UPenn named Adolph Reed, who's been very controversial in his critiques. So that's the end of our lecture for today. And I will see you, not next week, in 2 weeks from today, we'll meet again to talk about critiques of nationalism. Cool. Any questions or concerns?
Just to confirm, so we don't have class next week, we have it 2 weeks from now, right?
Correct, yeah. So our next week on Thursday is